We'll go ahead and get started this morning. Thanks for everybody making it to Grand Rounds this morning. I think we have a special treat and an honor to present this morning. Dr. DeWall and Mrs. DeWall, welcome from the School of Medicine that you were so integral in starting, as well as from the Department of Surgery. This morning, we're going to discuss a little bit of history and a little bit of local history, and Dr. Gilkison is going to bring that to life for us. I think growing up in Ohio, really the reason people come to Southwest Ohio is because you grew up here, you trained here, or you have family that draws you here. But I think Dr. DeWall is a little bit different to that, and I think we should all be grateful for that. Growing up in Kettering and going through school in fourth grade, you talk about social history and Ohio history. You hear about inventors such as Charles Kettering, and who started at NCR and then went on to develop the electric starter, amongst other things, as well as Mr. Patterson, who saw the use of a thing called the cash register and brought that to life for NCR. But there's a lot of, as well as two brothers that owned a bike shop that showed the world how to fly, as well as other people in town that you hear less about. And I think that's a little bit of what we're trying to do today. Talk about a man who is a physician, as well as a surgeon, an inventor, and an educator, and how maybe there's someone else in the room that can do something similar as they go on in life. So this morning, I will do the introduction of Dr. Gilkison. Dr. Gilkison, as you know, is a general surgeon, vascular surgeon here at town, working both at Kettering as well as Miami Valley. She's integral in the education of residents as well as medical students. Dr. Gilkison did her medical school at Loma Linda and then graduated from Minnesota, both in general surgery as well as vascular, and did some time in the research lab in Minnesota. And then did a fellowship at Baylor, if I remember right. And how this all ties into everything, I think Dr. Gilkison is going to bring to life for us. So nonetheless, I'll get out of Dr. Gilkison's way.
Good morning, good morning. Well, I went to University of Minnesota, and one of the nice things about University of Minnesota is they put this huge emphasis on resident education. They actually have a surgical education department, and when you arrive, they say, "What lab do you want to go into?" And you say, and you clear your throat a couple times. You say, "Give me some options," and they give you about 18 options, about 18 different labs you can enter, and you set that up from like day one, and you don't actually start thinking about the funding very much at all. In fact, that is one of the main things that I did not know until I did research for this lecture, is that the funding for surgical residents, even today, is being based off patents that are being created at University of Minnesota in perpetuity. They have actually a medical device design fellowship where they have 2 surgeons, 2 engineers, 2 chemists, two patent lawyers, and 2 MBAs candidates. And these are all people doing an extra fellowship. They take a year out of their life, and their goal is to make a patent a month. No goals there, just excellence. So this is what they're doing, and I did not do that. I thought it would be cool, but I ended up doing the surgery route and doing a critical care infectious disease fellowship. But in the lab, as you're pulling beakers out and you're doing stuff and you have pipettes, and for me it was a pig lab. We were doing surgery and critical care and bleeding the pigs down. You actually can pick up a beaker that has inscribed in etching on the side Frank Serra, one of the founders of acid-base balances back in the day. There's Dr. Lillahei, some of the stuff that he didn't take to New York. There's stuff from just amazing Wagestein pumps that are back in the back recesses of the department, and it gives you this sense of humbleness, because these guys, other than Wagestein, these guys were residents. These were house officers. These were people in the middle of their training. And this is where Dr. DeWall's story comes in. As you're there, as you're talking to people, they say, "Well, go over to Lillahei Museum." So you walk over to Lillahei Museum, and as you round the corner, on the right-hand side, the wall, there's a 12 by 12 section on the wall that is dedicated to you. And it has your original pump sitting in the corner with a plexiglass around it and a radio button like they do in every museum you've ever seen in your life. And you go, and the pump starts to work, and it pumps water through the process, and you can see the bubbles being formed, and it can trickle down and come on through. I actually called the Lillahei Museum last week and asked one of the secretaries, can you walk over to the corner and take your iPhone and make a little video of this thing working? They got a funding for a whole brand new building, and they have it all in crates right now, and they're moving up the street because they're putting in a light rail between Minneapolis and St. Paul. So I don't have a video of it running, but it does run. I saw it in 2010. So that's my tie from Minnesota. Then I went to Baylor, and at Baylor they have a DeBakey Museum. It's about 2 times the size of this building, or this room. And they have a Cooley Museum, which is 3 times the size of this room, because they were always in competition. So, and they have your original auctioneer in many, many pictures as they went around the world at the very beginning in 1955, 56, and 57, 58. They would go to places like Venezuela and Costa Rica, and they went to all over the planet, really heralding the heart-lung machine and heart surgery. So this is where I've been seeing this for so long, and then I met Becky Wang, and she is integral to helping me introduce to you, and I appreciate your hospitality in coming today. So that's kind of the background where we got started, and realize that I am as much of a groupie as I am a speaker today. So objectives, because this is the Grand Rounds and we're trying to help everybody go forward. Brief history of cardiac surgery, outline of Dr. DeWall's contribution to cardiac surgery, and then a brief history of the origin of the Wright State University School of Medicine. So vascular surgery does not start except at the beginning. The beginning is heparin. A medical student in the lab for Dr. Howell, medical students here in the front row, Dr. McLean actually walked over to Dr. Howell's lab and said, I want to work in your lab so I can get some publications. Dr. Howell said, project over there, they found a chemical agent, and that's history. They actually named it, Dr. Howell named it after hepra, that's the Latin for liver, because they derived it out of the liver. And basically, later, they discovered the agent first, discovered what it did second, and they found out it was an anticoagulant. They could not quite synthesize it for chemical use, so Dr. Best, Charles Best, Nobel Prize laureate for insulin, discovery of insulin, that was his second project. After he had fine-tuned and mechanized the production of insulin, the second project he did was mechanize and fine-tune the production of heparin. And the very first use of heparin by Dr. John Gibbon was actually, Dr. Best actually created the heparin for him to use in his models with cats as he was using his original heart-lung machine. And this is the original machine. That's his wife, Molly. She was his lab director, essentially. So he was a surgeon, and she was the lab director. And she helped develop for 20 years, even before in the 30s, all through World War II, and then onward. So we talk about open heart surgery, which leads you to think there must have been closed heart surgery. Things that were causing children to die, and doctors just knew that they were dying. They didn't quite know exactly what was going on. Angiography was just in its beginning. Ultrasonography was in the future. And they had just the basics of physical exam and what was going on. So this is just some basic ideas of how they closed atrial septal defects. The first is an outside. You should basically make a toroid circle because you're closing the ASD through a large chamber. But by closing the ASD from outside inside, you make like a donut toroid kind of shape. The other atrial septoplexy, can't say that very well, but you basically put your finger in, make a hole, put your finger in, and so it closes from the outside inward with the suction going at full rate. And then there is no real answer. So that's just the simplest of big defects. Well, it's complex to fix. But then there's tetralogy of flow. So this Miss Dr. Tassing, she was starting cardiac surgery, cardiology, and she met Dr. Blaylock there as he transferred from, I want to say he transferred from Virginia. Vanderbilt, you're absolutely right. Vanderbilt to Johns Hopkins, and she had first gone to Dr. Goss and said, "Can you help me fix tetralogy of flow? I think you just need a systemic shunt, pulmonary systemic shunt." Dr. Gross said, "No way. That seems like murder. We can't do that. That's not going to work at all." And so she said, "Well, fine. I'll because Dr. Blaylock was the guy that invented the first patent ductus arteriosus closure. So he said, no, I'm not going to do that. Because remember, what she's proposing is actually that you keep the patent ductus arteriosus open. Don't let it close. Keep it open artificially by making a bypass. So she went to Dr. Blaylock, and he said, I will look into it. He had already done some work trying to use the pulmonary hypertension model, and he'd already created a pulmonary systemic shunt for his, in his dog lab. He'd actually taken the subclavian, swung it down to the left pulmonary, and had already tried to create pulmonary hypertension. So he used the same technique that he'd used in his dog lab, tried it some more for tetralogy of Fallot, and did the first systemic pulmonary shunt in November 1944. And this is the first blue baby syndrome, blue baby operation. This made headlines. This was a big deal. So what's interesting about Tussing is that she didn't really advertise this very much, but on her biography, she actually turned deaf early on in her career. That's hard for a cardiologist. Think about that. Stethoscope is now off your tune. Evidently, she developed a sense of touch and a sense of watching the child and a sense of their blueness and a sense of the vibrations on their thin chest walls. And she could actually make diagnoses and then help develop some of the more non-stethoscope methods of diagnosing. Remarkable lady. As we go forward, other things. This is Dr. Goss, as I mentioned, he did the patent ductus arteriosus closures. This is how he attempted to do ASD. He had 3 successful surgeries doing this. I expect this to be one of the scariest surgeries I can imagine. It takes a lot of guts just to come up with this idea of making an atrial well, using a rubber bag on the side, make it so that it levels out with the RA pressure, that way that you have a water line, and then reaching down, finding it with your finger, not seeing it ever, just being underwater and sewing a patch in place. And patch is how we got it to work. And then we introduced in kind of World War II. This is where there's many surgeons, including Dr. Lillahei, who are Dr. Lillahei was out in North Africa and in Italy. These guys are taking care of horrendous injuries, including some that have bullet and shrapnel wounds in their heart. And they're finding the impossible sometimes possible. And this is where Dr. Harkin comes in. He was an Army surgeon here stateside, and he would have people come back with these, basically called heart cripples is what they were labeled as, and they would have either embedded shrapnel or tumbling shrapnel in as a foreign body inside the heart. And so what he did is he first took it to the lab. Remember, this is what surgeons do. You first practice, get rid of the learning curve, and then you proceed towards humans. So he did animal studies. He put foreign bodies in animals, and then I think it was dogs, and the first 14 died all together. The second 14, half lived. He's getting better. The third 14, only 2 of the dogs died. At this point, he said, I think I'm ready to take this technique in. I'm faster, I'm better, I got the suction planned out, and he was able to take care of all the soldiers, and all the patients lived, which is a remarkable feat in the sense that cutting a hole in the side of the heart has a tremendous amount of blood loss in the process. So, but it did break down some barriers. He published this. He got presented at American College of Surgery and American Chest Surgery. The first elective successful open heart surgery was done by Dr. Lewis and Dr. Varco. They performed the elective successful open heart surgery, and they did this for a 5-year-old with an atrial septal defect. They did hypothermia and inflow occlusion, which gave them about a 10-minute window for a patient of this size and number of kilograms. The interesting thing is that's a lot to do in 10 minutes. You have to get it open, you have to fix it, and you have to get it closed, all before, and making sure there's no air in the system, there's no clot in the system. This is a lot to do. This is a story told me by the critical care guy, Dr. Beelman. He told me that Dr. Lewis would routinely just kick anesthesia out of the room because they don't help me in the lab and they're not going to help me now. I got to do it. You guys leave. You make it worse, is what he's quoted as saying. I don't know if there's anesthesia in the room. I apologize, but it's just what I've been told. So, like I said, they cooled the patient down. They took him in they had actually I think it was a cow feeding trough. hooked it up to a machine so they can pump and keep the temperature at a single level, and then basically cooled to the 81 degrees, and occluded the vena cava, opened the right atrium, closed the ASD, and then closed the heart, all within the 10 minutes. It's impressive. But that's not a way to go for bigger, larger patients, and you need more time. There's more complicated things. They need more time, essentially. Dr. Given, as we had showed earlier, he was already working on the heart-lung machine, this apparatus that was a film screen oxygenator, mechanical heart, and he was working in coordination ultimately with IBM. He spent 20 years developing this with his wife, Mally, and it was an incredibly complex machine, exceedingly expensive. They were able to use it successfully. It took several teams of people to do it, but they were able to be successful in 1953. The first case was successful. The subsequent cases were not successful, and Dr. Given did a self-moratorium on what this was done. Luckily, he actually sold the machine to Mayo, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But for him, he was done with this part of his career, and he didn't go on to do any more open heart surgeries that involved this machine. We get to March 26, 1954. We're coming on the 60th anniversary of this. Dr. Lillehei and Dr. Varco do something called cross circulation. Interestingly, Dr. Cohen and Dr. Warden, they were talking, this is a story that you gave on an oral interview previously. They were talking, they were surgical residents, they were in the lab, they were talking to each other, and one of their wives was pregnant. And that actually was the impetus, the idea of what if the parent is the oxygenator, biologic oxygen donor for the patient. That's remarkable thinking. Of course, it also gives you that chance of having 200% mortality. That's too bad. But they didn't ever have any trouble with that. But it did have trouble when they first started proposing it. They had done it in the lab, had plenty of dogs live, but when they started proposing it to the administration of surgery, there were some cardiologists, there were some administrators that didn't want this to happen. So Lillehei actually go into Wangenstein, and Wangenstein said, and showed him his lab data, showed him what he'd done, and Wangenstein endorsed him, and it was Dr. Wangenstein who actually helped push that forward, because Wangenstein was the advocate for the administration to do privileges for this case. So what is cross circulation? It's where the father, O-type blood, gives as a biologic donor for the child and gives time, that vital amount of time for the patient. I mean, this is just pure love from a father's point of view. It makes your heart just amazed at parenthood. It's just a matter that they could get into the heart, they can see for the first time ever a dry field. This is an amazing feat. They would go on to do 45 patients. They'd publish the first 45 patients. At the beginning, sometimes they'd open up thinking that they were going to find an ASD, and they'd find tetralogy of Fallot because their original diagnosis was wrong. Sometimes they'd open up and they'd have no idea what kind of congenital malformation they had. They had just looking at a scrambled, maybe an atresia, maybe a correctation. They had all kinds of time where they did not know what they were looking at. But of this, a remarkable amount. And they did a 30-year follow-up, and 22 were still alive at 30 years, which, considering that the cardiologists would not give them to Dr. Lillehei until they were at the cusp of death, oftentimes losing weight, oftentimes very sick little babies. So this is an incredible outcome. But Dr. Lillehei knows that this is not the way of the future. Sometimes the blood doesn't match up quite well. You have to prime it with a lot of blood. And sometimes it's just not feasible. As the child gets larger, we're going to have to do heart surgery on adults sometime. So Mayo buys Given's apparatus, starts working on it, gets IBM some sponsorship, and they have a team of engineers, team of physiologists, and they start really working on the heart-lung machine. And it was used in a very large series prior to them switching to Dr. DeWall's machine. This is a younger picture of Dr. Kirkland, and an older picture, and then the original machine that they used in the lab. Dr. Lillehei and Dr. DeWall, this is where DeWall this is kind of where you enter the story. This is, you finished your time in the public service during the Korean War, and then basically you, as your story begins, you were thinking about a rheumatic heart patient that you had had when you were in the public health service. And he thought about this patient and he said, the heart is a mechanical problem. I gotta close the mic. The heart is a mechanical problem. It's a pump, and this is a mechanical problem. The rheumatic heart valve has destroyed the mitral valve. So these are both mechanical problems. So Dr. DeWall had some plaster of Paris, and I assume a pocket knife, and carved a prototype of a valve, and just thought about the way that a valve would work inside the heart. And just as I guess technically you were a graduate, you were a physician, but as a year of internship in the public health service, I would say you're probably at like a general practitioner level. Knowing that he didn't want to stay in the general practitioner, he wanted to head towards laboratory medicine. So he had this prototype, don't know exactly what to do with it, but he had a good professor. He had Dr. Varco. Remember the Varco that we had already mentioned before? He had Dr. Varco as his professor, I assume in an amphitheater similar to this. But Dr. Varco seemed to be an interesting guy, seemed to be an engaging fellow. So he drove from his home outside Minneapolis and drove into the city and called the secretary of Dr. Varco and said, I need to talk to Dr. Varco. I imagine wearing suit and tie and being humble as a first year doctor would be to a esteemed professor. And the secretary says, yeah, he's in the operating suite. And according to Dr. DeWall, he walked up to the operating suite. And sure enough, the esteemed Dr. Varco, they sat on a litter outside the OR, and they both sat in the litter. He took out his plaster of Paris valve. They looked at it, and they exchanged thoughts and ideas. And here this esteemed professor is talking to this lowly person that he probably doesn't know, because I don't know everybody in this audience. But he sat there, and they exchanged ideas. And he realized what a good mind Dr. DeWall had. And in that moment, he decided to give him the biggest referral you can give at the time was Dr. Varco's referral to Dr. Lillehei, because Dr. Lillehei had this huge lab that was running and working. So he says, I'm interested in laboratory medicine. He's not a surgical resident at this point. And he walks over to Lillehei, or introduces him to Dr. Lillehei's lab. He joins two other residents, Dr. Warden and Dr. Cohen, in the lab. One's leaving and one's coming, because this is kind of transitioning in the summertime. And basically, he becomes on as an animal attendant, which actually had like 3 times the salary of a resident. Yay. So at the time, it worked out really well. Good for you, Diane, I imagine. So he works in the laboratory medicine. And this is where Dr. Lillehei, basically, he comes on and he runs basically in patient 2 onward as the perfusionist for the cross circulation, the one with the father and the son. And runs basically, you weren't there for the first one, I understand, but you were there for the subsequent ones, and as a perfusionist, ran the pump. This is a huge deal. So they realized that they needed to get a better system. So Dr. Lillehei talks to Dr. DeWall and says, hey, if you'd like an opportunity, that always means, hey, do this. If you'd like an opportunity, we need to get something that was more sustainable. He gave him 2 pieces of information. This is interesting. This is something that I've never said to anybody. He said, don't look up at all the literature. Don't find out about everybody else's mistakes. It will cloud your mind. I have never said that to anybody, by the way. But it's interesting that luckily Lillehei did. He said, I don't want you to know about all the failures, and I don't want you to know about all the other machines and discs and films and all this stuff. And he said, 2, bubbles seem like they're difficult, and don't go with a bubble oxygenator. Well, that's kind of where he ended up going. But that's not the point. The point is, he gave him very little direction. He said, use your mind, use your physiology, use the lab, use the dogs, use what we have. And so after I don't think I've listened to about 8 of your oral histories or transcripts. I don't know how many trials you did before you got the one that worked, but the one that worked is the machine that I showed you at the very beginning. And this is the machine, you actually did it in the lab on 10 dogs, had the dogs playing, and they opened up his chest and did a sham valve operation, injured the valve, fixed the valve, closed the heart up, let the dogs go and play around. And then after you had 10 dogs that worked and they were all, playing around, you brought Lillehei over to see the happy, playful dogs. I think that's really smart. Make sure that they're happy and playful by the time you get your boss to see it. So once this happens, Lillehei then takes it to Wangenstein and says, I think we have something here. And that is where it gets so very amazing. So they start with the first case is, Given Mayo Kirkland did jump the gun here. They got just a little bit ahead, and in May 22, 1955, he was able to use this screen oxygenator. They got it more, you can see it actually starting to look more refined, and they were able to repair a VSD. So, but at this point, if you look at the machines, this is a huge, the machine goes all the way down to the floor, and all the working parts are underneath on the stand. This is a huge, complicated machine that took 4 technologists to run it at any given time, and they had to run chemistries, they had to be running laboratory, they were having a lot of hemolysis issues. So it's not as fine-tuned, nor as simple as this one. So the tubing was interesting because Dr. Lillehei had a friend that, I think it was tubing for mayonnaise, plastic tubing that they used in the food industry, the inch-wide tubing, and it became fortuitous because glass, actual raw glass, causes blood to lose some of its coagulant properties and causes some chemical reactions with glass, whereas plastic does not. So because they had an extra amount of tubing, that it actually worked out very well. This is a schematic. This is Dr. DeWall when he's a young guy. This is a schematic of what it is. Basically, get the laser going here. Basically, you have the blood coming in from venous blood here, coming in, going through, getting oxygen coming through at the bottom. This is where oxygen tanks coming in. They're actually large bubbles that are being created. I believe you had written that you had put a 22 gauge, several 22 gauge needles in the bottom of a cork, and the cork is what's holding in the place as the inflow. That's not it. As the inflow here. It goes up through here, exchanging with the surface area, the bubbles rising, and then there's an exhaust right through here that lets the CO2 out and any kind of bubbles that are in the system. And then this is kind of the defoaming system here that's coated with a defoaming A that's come from Corning. Dow Corning, I think, invented the anti-foaming A. They did it for jet engines so that when the jets were going high and low, they were having foaming in the gas tanks, and they needed an anti-foaming agent, so they created that, but you used it as a coating for your tubing, I understand, and then that made sure that there was no micro bubbles and no foam in the blood, and then as it came down through here, this was about 6 to 8 foot tubing of plastic tubing, and nobody wants to have part of your machine over here and part of your machine over there, so instead of that, put it on an inclined plane and put it on a helix so that you don't have an unwheeling machine. And then with that being said, you run through the pump. This is like a milking machine type pump. It kind of drums in this manner. This kind of helps you know, but it's on the outside of the tubing, so it's not actually on the inside of the tubing. And then as it goes through back through, now it's oxygenated blood through here. A remarkable, simple, elegant design that changed the world. Here's a different dial. This is the one that you used in your publication. I don't know exactly who drew this, but this is on your original publication. This is the original drawing. And the helix was added. And what was interesting is they kept using the laboratory. This is so vital. So Dr. Lillehei would say, hey, we got a 20 kilogram kid. Are we okay with that? Yeah, we're okay with that, but let me test it out. So Dr. DeWall would go to the lab, upscale the system, test it on several dogs, several animals, maybe sheep, whatever, and then, yeah, we can do that. And then they would go, well, I need to do maybe 30 kilogram somebody. And then, I don't know, let's see. So they upscale it, run all the physiology, run it all through the test, and they'd work their way up to an adult patient. That's critical. People would come and visit. 1955, 1956, there were people coming from all over the world. I'll go to that. People coming from all over the world, and they look at it and say, hey, I know, this looks simple, I could figure this out. And I think the quote you said was people had already started to change the model by the time they hit the plane. And they would show up at, X city, I can do this, and then just kill people off because they didn't know the physiology, they didn't know the angles, they didn't know the defoaming, they had better ideas, but they didn't test it because they were surgeons and they were arrogant and they said, I can do this, and they proceeded. But this is where Lillehei was so genius. He and Dr. DeWall, they tested it. They knew the physiology. They knew where it came through. They knew what it was going to do. Can you do a 30 kilogram? Can we do 40 kilogram? Absolutely we can. Look at this. That we got this sheep's alive. We know we can do this size of person. And it was all done through physiology. And basically, as you entered your basic kind of not salesmanship, but more telling the world, they did patent it, but they didn't keep it restricted. People could come in, people could look at it, people could come and say, this is how it's done. And they opened their doors. They had an amphitheater OR, they had people come in from all over the world, and very generous. Lillehei was very generous in his sharing of knowledge of what was going on. And then basically, having no major moving parts that was in contact with the blood, that's a big deal. That was made essential. Hundreds of surgeons came by, and it was freely given. This is a quote from Dutton Cooley. This is actually from one of his biographers. And I'll read this verbatim because it kind of gives you an idea of, you have these 90 miles apart, you have these two competing models. You have Kirkland and his Gibbon Mayo IBM slick, couple $1,000 machine, and you have $24 Dr. DeWall Lillehei machine. 18, I'm so sorry, I misquoted. $18 Dr. DeWall Lillehei machine with mayonnaise tubing. So this is what he says. The contrast between the two institutions and the two surgeons was striking. We observed Lillehei and a team composed mostly of house staff correct a ventricular septal defect using cross circulation. During the visit, we also saw a oxygenator developed by Dr. DeWall at the University of Minnesota. The next day, we observed John Kirkland. It's only 90 miles apart. You just sleep in Minneapolis, show up the next day in Rochester. The next day, we observed Dr. Kirkland and his impressive team in Rochester that made up of physiologists, biochemists, cardiologists, and others. The others was probably about 4 engineers. As they performed operations using the Mayo-Gibbon apparatus. Such a device was beyond my organizational capacity. Remember, this is right around the time where he's just kind of starting to form the idea of Texas Heart Institute, and they're having the beginnings of problems with Dr. DeBakey and Kool-Aid issues. So he's thinking about his own institute, and he doesn't have a big budget for this Gibbon machine. But he's still embedded in Baylor at this time. He's not yet broken off. Thus, I was deeply disappointed on my return to Houston when Dr. McNamara stated that he would not permit me to operate on his patients unless I used the Mayo-Gibbon apparatus. Why? Because they started these series. They started publishing. They seemed more esteemed, but in reality, it was very, very difficult. Cooley was successful in convincing his cardiologist that the era of open heart surgery had arrived, and in 1956 began to perform open heart surgery successfully using the DeWall Lillehei machine. Why is that important? Because this is one of the most prolific heart surgeons in the country, is Dr. Cooley and Dr. DeBakey down in Houston. And this is a picture from his autobiography, and he's using your machine. It looks like he's modified it just a little bit, but it's the same machine if you look in the pictures. And this is, he's in Venezuela, and that's one of his perfusionists there and with him. He would take a perfusionist, a house officer, and himself, and they would go, as the 3 of them, down to really all over the world. This is, I found this picture, this shows in China, 1958. The first open heart surgeries performed there, and this is also a modified view. This is, if you look, it has the same principles of what Dr. DeWall's machine is there. And you can see the helical design, you can see the defoamer in the top, but it's the same machine, and it's being used globally. The first, Japan and China both used this machine, not the same machine, but a similar machine. So then in 1956, this is a very rapid progression. Dr. Vince Gott, and we're going to do a different lecture for him if we wanted to. He helped with the development of the first pacemakers. Remember, it's easy to get the patient closed, but it's hard to get them off and going if they don't have the right rhythm. So Gott was part of that. But he was in the lab still, and they took 2 pieces of plastic, pressed them together, created the same tubing, but now made it in a contained, disposable, much cheaper unit. And you can kind of see on the top picture, this was actually used from your publication also. You can see that this has the lights put on it for photography effect, so people could see all the parts of it. And then the other one is in use with Dr. Gott there on the side. And this is actually from Cooley's historical references. This is them at the very beginning, and this is the one that they used. They're setting it up and priming it. It has D5 the solution coming down and the blood kind of getting primed on top, and you can see the bag of blood on the far left. But this is now being manufactured. This is now comes out of the box, sterile. You don't have to set up all this elaborate tubing. You have the pump at the bottom, and this is now becoming a mechanized process. Remember, the key to all of this is that you can make the impossible seem routine. And this is what makes this so amazing, is that that's exactly what this machine did. And this is where funding from Minnesota happens. University of Minnesota had the license rights to it. They sell it to Travenol, and Travenol eventually becomes Baxter. So you guys probably have heard of Baxter. But this is actually this is a poster I found online. Someone selling it for $12.38 on Amazon. That you can get that classic poster. I should have bought it and got it autographed. I didn't think of it till right now. Anyways, the point being is you can see that this is the very beginning with this sheet pressed oxygenator. And just kind of keep. I'm jumping ahead a little bit because we're going to get to our history of into Wright State University. As he came here, he continued to work with bubble oxygenators and continued to work with better designs. A hard shell design makes it so that you have a more fixed volume and makes it easier to work with, and integrates with a heat exchanger. Remember, you're losing all this heat as it's going through this process, and having an integrated heat exchanger made a huge difference. And actually, the heat exchanger is still being used in all the membrane ones that we're using today, the capillary ones. And actually, in one of the oral interviews, you wrote that you actually started making the beginning capillary models with silicone. And in one of the interviews in Vanderbilt, you said that Dr. Eric Bakken actually helped you with the electronics of trying to get the silicone block and the capillaries to work. Which, if you guys know pacemaker history, Bakken, Medtronic, founder, I mean, he's like, I'm a groupie of his too. I mean, that's just amazing, but it's very cool. But then you got offered a spot in surgical residency, and you went on with your career and handed this original capillary ideas to the next resident that they came along. And you were quoted as saying that those ideas eventually ended up in Dow Corning's patents and ended up being what we use today as a membrane capillary oxygenator. But this is kind of the beginning points of Temptrol, and in 1966, this is where it has inflow of warm water to help keep this all in a warm system. We're getting time issues, so I'm going to kind of run through this. This is the Temptrol here. It was used for about a decade and a half before they started working on the more membrane capillary mechanisms. Dr. DeWall goes to Chicago and is there in the Chicago Medical School, Dean of Surgery. You were quoted as saying a lot of paperwork and not enough surgery. That sounds about right. I would want to get out of that too. So after 3 years, he was at the started working on trying to work towards artificial hearts, and you were talking with several people. You kind of let it known that you were kind of looking for a better situation. You got routed in with the Kettering founding of this hospital, and they started working with Cox Heart Institute, which is a Cox, I think it's the same as like the cable company ultimately, isn't it? The Cox News Network at the time. It was some, yeah, it was Jimmy Cox. He was the newspaper tycoon at the time, and I think it ultimately, and a governor. He ran for president against. His father ran for governor. Anyway, so it's a high functioning family here in Ohio, and they made the Cox Heart Institute, and they said we're going to set up a surgical laboratory for you. We'll set up a brand new hospital, and we'll get you to start from the very beginning. That's a lot of advantages coming here to Dayton, Ohio. And the advantages, you join 2 other surgeons, so you weren't all by yourself, Dr. Taylor and Dr. O'Brien, new Kettering Memorial Hospital, and then you can start a program from scratch, make sure there's no inherent problems built into it, and then you had strong financial support as you came. This is a picture of someone snapped of your first heart surgery here at Kettering, and I don't know exactly what you're doing there, but I assume that you're using one of your oxygenators. Started the general surgery residency program here at Kettering. That eventually got put into the Wright State. This is before Wright State Medical School was formed, but started an independent general surgery residency program here in '68. He's only been here about 2 years at that point. That's pretty fast. And then innovation and change. Always willing to embrace innovation. This was a press release written when I searched Cox Heart Institute. I found this press release that's in the archives of the Ohio State Historical Society that has an IBM computer. I think of, some Odyssey 2000 or something. IBM computer, 1800 computer, nurse alert system. So they would have monitors, and then they would go to a computer. The computer would then send it over to the Cox Heart Institute, and then doctors could be paged accordingly. It seems kind of clunky, but in 1969, that's a big deal. That's pretty cool. And this is a quote from you, and I probably take much more pride starting the medical school than I do in the perfusion systems. And so let's talk about that. Starting the Wright State University Medical School. As you came here, you realized that there were some similarities in both Dayton area, excellent hospitals, excellent residencies here, and no central hospital. Didn't find $100 million laying around to build a great Ohio State University kind of complex. So what do we have? What resources do we have? And remember, there is no Harvard University Hospital, so there's some very nice models. And I think that you actually went and visited one of the Kansas state models, medical schools early on. You were working on FDA, you went to Washington, D.C. Oh, sorry, first you went to talk to Dr. Kettering, so not Dr. Kettering, Mr. Kettering, and Al Martin, one of his managers of the Kettering Foundations. He then routed you towards NCR, just see what the public relations is in the community. What funding do we have? What support do we have? Where do the leaders of the community need to be? So he went to the top two. He went to Kettering and he went to NCR. At the time, that's the top of the heap. And with the help of the Bill Engler, public relations gentleman, he then said, well, let's think of how we work towards this. What is the politics of the area? How does this work? How do we get this going? And Dr. DeWall's only been here about 2.5 years. This is amazing that as soon as you got here, you said, we need a medical school. So you studied the fact that there was a shortage of doctors in Dayton, studied the fact that the demographics of the doctors in the Ohio State, that most people came from outside, and if they did train here, a lot of them left. And then basically realized that a medical school is a political animal. You are quoted about 5 or 6 times saying that statement in many, many places. And I think you're absolutely right in that. And you studied medical schools all over the country. And you were in a meeting in Washington, D.C., and you met with a guy named Dr. Cooper, who was the director of American Association of Medical Schools in 1968. And this gentleman, he was already working with Congress to try to get more places for people to study medicine because they were realizing that they were about 52,000 doctors short in the country at the time. So this starts the backing. So you have the principal people in the community, and you start getting Washington, D.C. How successful is that? That is like the model for how to approach a political animal. Didn't go to the university first, went to the community leaders and said, where's my support? Remember, go to the committee with a plan. Don't go to the committee with an idea. You got to go to the committee with a plan. And then you did exactly that. That's amazing. So you went to Dr. Cooper, got his support, and stayed in dialogue with several letters and, I understand, visits. And then you didn't know Wright State University. Wright State University was just being founded. There was I looked at the history of Wright State University. There were 4 buildings in Wright State University in 1968 or in 69 when you approached Dr. Golding. There were 4, including the original Allen Hall. So this is a very small university at this time, about 3,500 students, and the next year there's about 4,000 students. And he met with Professor Ennin, Norman Ennin, Department of Economics, who, I don't know if you knew that or not, but he was really high up in the faculty meetings and the faculty kind of societies. And so he knew Dr. Golding very well, and he introduced you to Dr. Golding. Dr. Golding was a president. Now this guy started the university. He had a lot of things going on. He had several building projects. He had several community things going on. I'm not sure he actually wanted to have one more thing on his plate, but you went with the right support. I've got Mr. Kettering. I've got NCR. I've got Washington, D.C. How could a guy like Golding, who wants to keep his career going, say, nope, don't want it? he, of course, graciously said, well, that's very interesting, and introduced you to Mr., I think, Wright, his secretary, his second in command, his vice president, and then you started working really well with him and getting the school going. And that's amazing because you've only been here like 3 years at this point. Really humbling. I've been here 2.5. So I went and pulled the original papers from Wright State University. This is the Guardian. It's funny because I have 5 papers that I pulled, and they all have like different fonts and stuff. I don't know if they were having fun with fonts. Anyway, so this is Dr. Golding makes the announcement, we're going to proceed, and this gets citywide coverage, and they start formulating this plan to go towards the Ohio State Senate. You wrote a 790-page document, some 700-plus page document for the first proposal for the Ohio State legislature to see. That's a huge book. That's like a Harry Potter book. Well, regardless, it went it hit the doors at Ohio legislature, and whoa, you stirred up a pot of hornets. Because now you have Toledo, now you have Ohio State University, now you have Cincinnati, all saying, whoa, we don't need another medical school. We need more medical students. Put your funding in our schools and we'll take the money. We'll take the money. We'll take the money. Did you get the theme there? And you kept your guns and said, no, we don't need you to give more money to the other medical schools. We need you to form a medical school here, because if you have a medical school in the city, people will stay in the city. Most people end up within a 50 to 60 mile radius of where they train, and that is so very true. So if you train them in Columbus, they'll go to Columbus. If you train them in Toledo, they'll go to Toledo. If you train them in California, they'll stay in California. So it's just, you had that foresight, say, no, we can't do that. So you made friends with a Carla Weisenborn? Maybe I got that spelled wrong. Anyways, she was your advocate at the legislature. She was in Congress, in the Ohio Congress, for almost 30 years and ended up actually going to the Senate. But she was the advocate. She was local. She knew the people. She knew NCR. She knew Kettering. She knew Golding. She knew you. She knew the city. And every time people would come up at the state level and Toledo would be making a rant or something, she would stand up and would be there. That's the hardest part. You just got to be there. You have to be there every single time to make sure that your point of view is represented. And she did that. And she was a very strong advocate for Ohio. It's kind of fuzzy because I copied it out of the archives. But this is the announcement that they actually sent to the legislature. This is 1973. And sent to Senate Bill 457 is what ultimately started the school. So the actual Senate convened about this bill. And then you start having these arguments. This is where they're starting to have arguments back and forth. Well, maybe you're just doing it so you can get more money for the Wright State University. But this is where Golding was smart. He starts making sure that Miami Valley, that University of Dayton, he makes sure that the community, each of the community universities all have a position on the admission board. That's brilliant. Making sure that he's not just all Wright State University people. And then ultimately, it gets completed, and in 1972 they pass it. The U.S. Congress gives money, the VA gives money, and in 1973 the school gets started. This is a huge deal. After the medical school got started, really you went on and you started doing a lot of valvular implants, and did a lot of, is the original Kettering Kessler valve that turned into the Omniscience, and the Omnicarbon valve. And you implanted this flat leaflet valve, and you performed hundreds of these and did some of the validation studies through the Cox Heart Institute. And then I know 1 year you were quoted as doing almost 900 heart surgeries in 1 year. That's an incredible number at your peak. And then you retired, and now we get to honor you here today. And I'm just amazed by what you've done. We're getting time issues, and I want to have some questions. Just to quote Dr. Cooley, Lulahai is a talented investigator and pioneer surgeon who provided a can opener for the largest picnic thoracic surgeons will ever know. I would say Dr. DeWall made the can opener for Dr. Lulahai. I am honored to be here with you, and I am your eternal fan. by the numbers, 88 published peer-reviewed articles, multiple coronary cardiopulmonary bypass machines, multiple heart valves validated, millions of hearts repaired worldwide, one medical school, hundreds of student doctors reaching even more patients. I'm honored. Thank you. Microphone set up. I know you didn't want to talk too much. If you had any questions at all, Dr. Pavlina, I appreciate you being here. I know you actually took Dr. DeWall's chair when I was hired here.
Well, I think hey Dick.
Hi, Pete.
Hi. Nice to see you. Well, the one thing that I'd like to say is Dick and Diane are just regular people, which is really a pleasure. You know, when I came here, I guess I have to confess a story. I started practicing out of my realm, I guess. And one morning, when I joined the practice, I only met Dr. DeWall, I think, once or twice. And he shows up in the office. Of course, Dr. DeWall had several back surgeries before, and he was recovering from a recent back surgery done at Mayo Clinic. And he comes to my office with a 50 cc syringe in hand, and he says, "Pete," and remember, I've only been here for just a couple of weeks, and he says, "Pete, I got this seroma in my back, and I wonder if you can stick a needle in it and tap it off." I don't remember the story, but I said, "Okay." So put him on a table, prep him up, take the syringe in, stick it in, and draw off like 50 cc's of fluid, and sent him on his way. So I started practicing a little neurosurgery here. And a week later, Dr. DeWall shows up again with another syringe, and he says, "Pete, that fluid's back, tap it off again for me." So I draw 50 cc's off, and when I'm done, I says, "Dick, you suppose this could be cerebral spinal fluid?" And well, to make a long story short, Dick never showed up in my office again. But the one thing that I have to say is they're just really genuinely very nice, down-to-earth people, and I certainly really appreciated that. I never felt like I was very small compared to Dick. He made everybody feel equal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question in the back.
Yeah, not a question, but an observation. I'm George Brown. I was about 10 or 15 years before him when I joined DeWall. And I am one of those guys from Hopkins and University of Maryland. And I actually did make rounds with Helen Cosick.
Oh.
And we had to do the listening when we were medical students for her.
Was she as deaf as they say?
Absolutely. And she was a real pain in the ass. But that being said, she actually made a lot of mistakes with congenital diagnoses, but she was fantastic when looking at x-rays. She had a stethoscope that was about 3 feet long, and she really couldn't hear. That's true. Blaylock was there. He had died a couple of years before I finished medical school. He was a terrible surgeon. And the guy in the lab, Vivian Thomas, who was a black, uneducated individual who devised that bypass operation, the Blaylock-Cosick operation, actually did them in the operating room with him. And Denton Cooley was the man of the day. What I want to say about him is that when we came in from my training, we used to take the heart-lung machine from Kettering and put it on a garbage truck because it had a lift, and we take it up to Miami Valley and do the heart surgery.
No way.
Bring it back. That's how we did our surgery, because we had one heart-lung machine for the city. Did they take that over to Good Sam? I don't know. Did they take, over you and I used to haul it up to the valley, remember?
Yeah.
Until we finally got one. But Dr. Spencer wrote an article about the 9 leading people, great people in the United States who made cardiac surgery what it is. And he was one of the 9. And that's a fantastic experience to work with him. When I went to China after I retired, we still used his heart-lung machine, the bubbler. Dr. Finley back here, who introduced me to the Chinese aspects of things, we used to use his bubbler 6 times. We'd wash it out and use it again for our heart surgery. So we got away with some stuff. By the way, I don't know whether everybody knows Dr. Finley back here, but he was in the operating room for the first open heart surgery with Dr. Gibbon.
Oh, wow. Wow.
He was in charge of the heart line. And interestingly enough, Dr. DeWall talked about the cross circulation, and you're right, 200% mortality. Well, I got to do one of those patients 28 years later.
No kidding.
Yeah, she had an infected patch from the VSD that Dr. Lillihigh in DeWall had done 28 years before.
Wow.
So there you go. It comes around. I want to say to these young medical students, this is a fantastic opportunity to get back and do what you got to do. Do what you think is important. You know, Denton Cooley made a statement once too, when I was down there working with him. You got to have the courage to fail. And these guys had the courage to fail. And that didn't mean they were going to walk out of that operating room with a success. But the next one was a success, and that's what made it work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Kind of a pointless little note that was important in my work, but I'll bring it up. But Walt Lilley told me, don't fool around with bubbles because they only give you a lot of grief. So I took him for his word, and I started with bubbles, without a bubble system. And I had this long plastic hose to run the blood down the hose and take it. Lower third of the hose was a reservoir, and so that hold the blood there that I'd put in from the top. But what kind of blood went in? At that time, they had no place in the literature, this is where I didn't really follow Walt completely, no place in the literature had they mentioned hyperbaric oxygenation. So I figured, well, nobody's thinking about hyperbaric, and Walt told me to make a machine, so I'll try hyperbaric. So I tried a hyperbaric system, and I was a little worried because I was using this plastic hose. I didn't know if it would stand 3 atmospheres of pressure or not. Well, of course, it would stand about 20 atmospheres, actually. So I started with the hyperbaric system, and it worked fine, except there was one defect in it, and that's when you decompressed it, it would bubble. So I figured, well, if you're going to have to deal with bubbles, you might as well learn to live with them. So then I just moved over to a bubble system, but I noticed also in that long and inclined tube that I had, the bubbles would rise to the top and the reconstituted blood would slide underneath. So it was a perfect bubble trap. So that's how the Helic bubble oxygenator came into being, through a hyperbaric system.
Incredible. Incredible. Any other questions?
First, I'm Margaret John, and I know a lot of people in this room realize that I've been the dean of this medical school for 3 weeks now, and you know, it's great. I mean, you did a great job, Julie, and it's just wonderful. I mean, having been here since '82, I'm aware of some of the early history of the school, but it was just you did a wonderful job of reviewing it, and also, you know, like Bob Finley, I'm also a Jeff grad. So when I was a medical student in the 70s, I had a lot of attendings that were Gibbons residents, so I got to hear in a lot of detail how badly people do when you perfuse them with foam, which was often the result of using Gibbons screen oxygenator, which is why I stopped using it. So So, I mean, there really is sort of an arc, and it's a very small world, so it's just a wonderful tribute. Thanks so much for just calling attention to this great story in our midst. And I'll just say to Dick, because he knows Dick Reiling very well. I was just talking to him in October at the American College Surgeons Board of Regents meeting, and Dick's starting to start a school in Charlotte, a community-based school in Charlotte. You might, I'll probably go down and be a consultant for him, but he's very much following your script down there.
Good.
Great guy.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I do want you to know that we are creating a Richard DeWall Endowed Lecture Fund. We've got the seed money, but we need more. I have some friends here that I'm looking at here, and just want to make sure we keep this spirit of surgical excellence alive and well, and keep this lectureship going for surgical excellence. I want to thank you again, Dr. DeWall, for being here.
Look up on the board, on the screen.
How do you do?
Couple right behind. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
There's several.
How do you do? Thank you for showing up.
Thank you.
I'm Josh Gustafson. I'm going to start my CT fellowship here in July
Very
at
good.
Ohio State.
Very good. Wonderful.
It's a pleasure to meet you and I've read history and be excited about that. So thanks.
There's a lot of history here.
So he was at University of Minnesota interviewing
And I've
before they packed up your machine. And
There it
here's
is, still working.
in the
Right here, that's fine. Nice. Excellent. In trouble, I can see it.